Okay, let's get started here. Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people in attendance for what will no doubt be an excellent discussion on Marxist economics and the capitalist crisis that we're currently living through. My name is Adam. I'll be your chair for the event today. For those of you who don't know who we are Fight Back, a socialist organization dedicated to building up the forces of Marxism across Canada and across the entire world. We've been seriously organizing in Canada for a number of decades and have been on the ground organizing at many rallies and events. Over the last year, we helped organize the first Labor Day in Montreal in years. We also helped organize Toronto May Day in 2019 and 2020, the second of which involved the trade unions for the first time in years. And last year, we held probably the first General Assembly and student strike vote in English Canada for 23 years, involving over 200 students. We're also part of an international organization called the International Marxist Tendency, which organizes all over the world in countless countries to strengthen the forces of socialism all over the globe. If you're not familiar with our publication, it's a socialist paper called Fight Back that covers the issues of the day in Canada. You can get a subscription which supports us and helps us financially build up our forces. A link will be posted in the chat that you can check out. Before we begin, let's deal with some logistical stuff. One thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to change your name in Zoom to reflect where in the country you are. This will help us see where you're from, and if we have a chapter in your area, you can get more involved with it. For example, you'll see my name is Adam Toronto. So to do this, you just go down and click participants and then hover over your name and the list of names on the side. Click rename and change it accordingly. That would help us a lot. To give you some details as to how the event will go today, it's super simple. Our speaker will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have an open discussion where questions, comments, and so on are encouraged. Anyone can speak, and there's no stupid questions. So I encourage new people who maybe this is their first event, they want to get involved, to ask questions and speak up. So make sure to note down anything you want to say, during the talk, and get involved in the discussion. I highly encourage it. The speaker today will be Alex Grant. Alex is a founding member of Fight Back and is one of the editors of Fight Back magazine. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Alex, and he can get us started. I'm just going to unmute him here. There we go.
Cool. Thanks, Adam. Okay, you hear me okay? Good. So, question. Why is capitalism failing? Why is capitalism failing? That is the purpose of this meeting, to figure that out. And I hope everybody agrees that capitalism is failing. Because if you think that this is a healthy society, well, you're definitely in the wrong meeting. Because there's incredible crisis out there in Canada, internationally. Just to detail some statistics, in the aftermath of, in the first few months of COVID, 3 million people lost their jobs. There was a 13% reduction in GDP. The stock market, the TSX, lost about 40% of its value. And if you walk around major cities today, you will see increasing homelessness, tent cities, reaching different sectors of the population than that have been reached by homelessness for generations. There is an extreme crisis going on. But if you're an apologist for capitalism, you'll say, well, that's just COVID. That's just COVID. Well, even COVID, they have dealt with that terribly, utterly terribly, that they've done everything in their power not to protect the population. They've always put money ahead of people. And ironically, that actually serves to destroy the economy. There's a quite interesting graph that showed that the countries with the highest incidence of COVID-19 relative to population also had the worst economic outcome. That just shows their extreme short-termist viewpoint, that they're not able to plan for the future, have confidence, that you take the public health measures in order to avoid the pandemic, that you take short-term economic pain and that helps you in the long term. No, the worst place, one of the worst places is right-wing governments, United States, Brazil, India, where they've just not cared about the people, not cared about the pandemic, and just tried to run the economy. Ironically, that ends up destroying the economy. But even in Canada, things have not been good by any means. But it's easy to write it off and say, well, this crisis, it's just COVID. It's just COVID. Well, that's not true. In fact, if you look back at previous capitalist crises, you look back at 2008, they said that was subprime mortgage. You look back at the crisis in 2000, that was the dot-com bubble. If you look back to the economic crisis of the 1970s, that was high oil prices. All the way back to the South Sea bubble and the tulip bubble. If anybody knows their economic history, look that up on Wikipedia. And they always try to find some excuse that capitalism is supposed to be the most efficient way of assigning goods and services. The invisible hand of the market is supposed to equilibrate and assign resources and be for the best of all people in the best of all possible capitalist worlds. Well, it's not true. It's blatantly not true. And in fact, the strategists of capitalism have got no explanation for the cause of crisis. They don't think there is any crisis under capitalism. They think capitalism is an equilibrium system. It's not an equilibrium. It's a wrecking ball. It swings from boom to slump to boom to crisis to crisis to crisis. And the capitalists are totally incapable of understanding why. And the only people who've actually been able to understand why capitalism is in crisis have been the Marxists. That, in fact, the greatest work of Marx was Das Kapital, 3 volumes, and the biggest work of Marxism is about capitalism. It's analyzing the structure and the cycle and the processes of capitalism. And there Marx explained how capitalism inherently tends towards crisis. And it's vitally important that us as socialists, as student activists, as intelligent workers, understand how capitalism doesn't work, how capitalism robs the workers, and how capitalism can be overthrown, and what is the alternative. So that's what we're going to discuss today. That COVID has clearly made the crisis worse. This is not any normal crisis. It is a capitalist crisis with a pandemic on top of it. But a healthy society could sustain a pandemic. A healthy society could take the measures to prioritize public health and do the necessary research and do the necessary social distancing and everything that needs to be done, shut down the parts of the economy that are not essential, and could weather this storm. But capitalism has shown itself completely incapable of weathering this storm. But even though COVID itself was an unpredictable accident, that nobody could tell that this specific virus would turn up at this specific time, Marxists have been talking about an economic crisis coming for quite a while now. Actually, if you don't take my word for it, go and look on our website. Go and look on marxist.ca and marxist.com and look at our website. And we have been predicting an economic crisis for the last few years. In fact, I wrote an article approximately a year ago titled Explaining the Coming Crisis of Capitalism, that sort of went into the growing contradictions of capitalism. And in that article, we said that it just needs a spark. It just needs something to set it off. You know, could be a trade war, could be a bankruptcy, could be a debt crisis, could be any number of things. It turned out that the spark that set off this crisis was the pandemic, but it was a crisis waiting to happen. And so I'm going to explain, to give the listeners today an explanation of why capitalist crises happen in general and why this one happened in particular. Now, the fundamental contradiction of capitalism is that workers are not paid the full value of their labor. That workers work 8, 10, 12 more hours a day, put in that much value, but they do not receive that full value back in wages. That what do workers receive back in wages? They're not paid for their labor. They're not paid for their labor. They're paid for what Marx called their labor power, their ability to work. That labor power, wages, is a commodity just like any other. That workers sell their ability to work to buyers, if they can find them. Those buyers are the capitalists. Workers sell that commodity to the capitalists, and then the capitalists get to use that commodity as they like. And the use of a worker's ability to work is a day's labor. But the value of the ability to work is not the same as a day's labor. The value of any commodity is the amount of time to reproduce that commodity. And how much time does it take to reproduce a worker? Well, a worker has got to have enough food, clothing, shelter for subsistence. So they are physically capable of getting up and going to work the following day. They've got to be educated. So there's the labor that takes to educate that worker. There's also got to be enough value to reproduce the working class, to support a family and children for the next generation of wage slaves. There's no point, exploiting your workers so hard that there's no working class in the next generation. Although, in some periods, they do this. And you've seen in many countries, actually, a collapse in fertility rates. The fertility rates in many Western countries I think it's like 1.5 children per woman, which is not a replacement of the population. And finally, there is a moral element. There's a moral element that is largely determined by the class struggle, actually, that by trade unions, workers organizing to fight against the capitalist class, of typical things that are deemed to be necessary to survive and live in a certain society over and above mere subsistence. So, and that changes in different countries, changes in different climates, and changes in different epochs. Many people now have a cell phone, a smartphone in the West, actually not just the West, but go back 20 years and that was a luxury, and go back another 20 years and it didn't exist, right? So those four elements make up the components of the value of labor power, the value of wages. But typically, for example, if a worker does a 10-hour day, the value of those four components, subsistence, education, reproduction, and moral component, typically does not encompass the full value of a working day. So they might work an 8-hour day, but the value of their wages is equivalent to 4 hours work. That's the value of labor power. That's the value of wages. And what happens to that extra four hours of value that the worker puts in? Well, that's where profits come from. That's where profits come from. Profits to the capitalist, profits to the banker in form of interest, profits to the landowner in the form of rent. So that's all the surplus value. And that's how the capitalists get all their money, from the unpaid labor of the working class. The capitalists functionally do nothing, right? When they say, oh, this capitalist built this, or this capitalist created that. Bull, total bull, right? Have you ever seen a capitalist down on the line actually building anything? How many capitalists have built houses or offices or schools or hospitals? No, that's done by working class people. Everything is built by working class people. Everything is made by working class people. Not a light shines, not a wheel turns without the kind permission of the working class. All the capitalists do is take the surplus and decide what to do with it. Some of it they consume themselves. They hang out on yachts. They get private jets, all of the luxuries. But they monopolize the social surplus of society, and a minority decides what to do with that wealth for profit, not for need, not for the need of the people, but for profit. And that's the fundamental condition of capitalism. This is a society that produces for profit and not for need. Okay, but what's wrong with that? Okay, apart from the unfairness of it all, the majority of us work for barely above subsistence, and a minority who do not work then monopolize all that wealth and have all the power and make all the decisions in society. Okay, it's damn unfair. I think we can all agree on that. But why wouldn't it work? Why wouldn't it work? Well, here's the problem. So the capitalists, who are they selling their commodities to? Like, for example, the Canadian economy is approximately $2 trillion. Canadian GDP is roughly $2 trillion. But let's say workers' wages are only $1 trillion. Well, $2 trillion of stuff have just been made by the workers. But the workers can only buy back 1 trillion. So 2 trillion have been made, and only 1 trillion can be bought back by the workers. Here you have what Marx called the inherent crisis of overproduction, right? Overproduction by capitalism, that the workers do not have the wages, do not have the wealth in order to buy back the stuff that they have just produced. But if you came to a sort of a clever objection to this, then capitalism, if that just was the situation, well, the capitalism would always be in crisis. Well, the capitalists have ways of getting around this crisis, that out of that surplus that the workers are not able to buy back, what do? They reinvest it. They reinvest it in new production, in new productive techniques. They develop the productive forces. They develop machinery. They develop new markets. I talked about cell phones. Cell phones were a new market. that when BlackBerry, I guess Canadian companies sort of started the smartphone market, but then failed to properly exploit it, and were taken over by Apple and Android and Google. Right, so that was when that started. There's great profits within the smartphone market, but now you've had that. Now you've had the law of diminishing returns, and really the new smartphones aren't that different from last year's, even though they tried to make them so they go bust every year or two, so you're forced to buy a new one. But so they reinvest it. They also export that capital. They export that surplus onto foreign markets and build up the productive forces in those countries. This is the economic basis of imperialism, right? Rather than build factories at home, well, you can build them in Mexico or Indonesia or China. Well, that also requires a military force to make sure that all that exported capital doesn't get expropriated by foreign workers or governments, right? So that is the economic base of imperialism. And the other way that they can expand the market and put off the crisis is by debt. Debt is essentially spending tomorrow's money today. And if workers go into debt, then they can buy more than the $1 trillion of their wages and expand the market and buy more stuff, which is all well and good in the short term, but eventually that debt has to be paid back. And it doesn't just have to be paid back as it is, it has to be paid back with interest. So this is the cycle of capitalism. This is the basic cycle of capitalism, the boom slump cycle, that they invest, they create more productive capacity, that then they create more. They export capital, which builds up productive capacity abroad, which then creates more, and they make the workers go into debt, who can consume more for a period until they can't. All of these things serve to increase productive capacity until the market can no longer sustain it. So the market for consumer goods can no longer sustain it, and the market for machinery, for capital goods, can no longer sustain it. Because why would you invest in capital goods? Why would you invest in machinery if there's already enough capacity in the existing machinery to make everything that anyone is willing to buy? That is the fundamental crisis of overproduction. And there's some very good statistics which show this to be absolutely true. You can see it, we've quoted this in a number of articles on marxist.ca, that one important statistic is called capacity utilization. Capacity utilization is the degree that the machinery is being run. So if a factory is capable of producing, so many items in a day, say 1,000 items in a day, are they actually producing 1,000? Are they producing 900, 800, whatever? Well, back in the 1970s, capacity utilization was approximately 80, 85%. So they would run the machinery at a sort of a 80, 85% rate. Over the last 40 years, there have been a steady decline in capacity utilization, and now it's regularly under 70%. So why would the capitalist invest in this environment? Why invest when the existing machinery can create more than enough that the market can buy? See, there is the crisis of overproduction. And this has been present for a number of years, just waiting for that spark to set it off. The other very important symptom of the crisis of overproduction is if you actually go to the Statistics Canada website, you can see where various sectors of society are keeping their investments. So are they, investing in Canadian companies? Are they investing abroad? And what is an increasingly important area where big business is keeping its wealth? It's in cash, dead money. It's $1 trillion. It's actually gone up from about $600 billion 5 years ago. 5 years ago, they kept $600 billion of money called dead money, doing nothing, uninvested, because they had no idea what to do with it. They were just sitting on this hoard of cash, like, a dragon from a Tolkien novel, and doing absolutely nothing with it. Now, the purpose of, the ruling class, the purpose of the capitalists is they're supposed to be, the captains of this industry who know how to run society and know how to run the economy. Well, they've abjectly failed. They couldn't run society. It's in utter crisis. They created massive inequality and poverty, but they couldn't even figure out what to do with billions and billions of dollars in order to invest, to push society forward. Well, it was $600 billion in 2015. Now it's over $1 trillion Canadian. And there's similar statistics in the United States, in Britain, in France, and Germany, all the major capitalist countries. They're just sitting on mountains of cash that they cannot productively invest, that they've got, and growth rates are previously were totally anemic, 1 or 2%, less than 2%. So this is the sort of inherent crisis of overproduction. And Marx and Engels explained this in the Communist Manifesto, where they said, how do the capitalists get out of this crisis? Well, by making the next crisis even worse. Now, the main way, the only real sustainable way for the capitalists to get out of the crisis is massive closures. Shut down factories, lay off millions of people. One economist called this the creative destruction of capital, to rebalance supply and demand, to solve the crisis of overproduction. So bring productive capacity down so it is back in line with the market in the economy. The trouble is, you lay off millions of people and they get a little bit upset. If they can't pay their rent, if they can't put food on the table, that this actually has revolutionary conclusions. That the question really arises, who pays for the crisis? Who pays for the crisis? Is it the ruling class? Is it the bosses and the bankers who actually caused the crisis, who've been benefiting and monopolizing all the money and wealth? Or are they going to make the poor, are they going to make the workers pay for the crisis? Of course, they're going to try and make the poor pay for the crisis. That's what they always do. But if you look back in history, you will see that the major driving force of the majority of revolutions is the question, who pays for the crisis? Who pays? That was the driving force behind the English Civil War, the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution. Who has the ability to tax and who has the ability to trade, right? Those are the major motor forces of so many of the revolutions in human history. And that is the condition that we're in right now. There is the mother of all crises, and who pays for it, who's going to be forced to pay for it, that question has not been answered. All right. So what are some of the ideas out there in order how to get over the crisis? Well, in the last sort of Great Depression was 1929 and went throughout the 1930s. And back then, governments had the philosophy known as laissez-faire. And this was the policy of essentially do nothing, that the invisible hand of the market solves everything. You let the market go and things will end up great eventually. Bit of pain, but it'll sort itself out. Well, what actually happened between 1929 and 1933? Well, over 4,000 banks went under. Unemployment rates went up to 25%. There was mass homelessness and utter crisis. And, companies went under, banks went under. The idea that the invisible hand of the market solves things was shown to be totally false, totally false. And today, both right-wing and reformist left-wing economists have abandoned laissez-faire. They all sort of look what happened with all the bank failures in 29 to 33. I guess you've got some libertarians believe in laissez-faire, that the state should just stay out of the economy. Actually, although the right-wingers, even the right-wing parties do say the state should stay out of the economy. They say that a lot. But when they're in power, they don't do it. There's always corporate welfare. There's way more welfare for the corporations than there is ever given to working class people. There's massive corporate welfare, which the libertarians, I guess, consistently criticize them for. Right? You're not a right winger. You're in favor of this corporate welfare, right? But if the right wing media and politicians were a bit more honest, well, they've come over to the economic philosophy of monetarism. And what this has been categorized as is socialism for the rich and free market capitalism for the poor. So the monetarists believe that the state should intervene to bail out the banks and big business, but should leave the working class leave the working class to fend for itself. That's sort of Hayek, Milton Friedman, these types. And it's a total hypocrisy. It's an utter hypocrisy. They say if capitalism works, why is there so much state intervention? It wouldn't need it. The fact is that capitalism doesn't work, and there have been trillions of dollars internationally gifted to the banks and big business to bail them out. It actually totally sort of negates the logic of capitalism, that it's supposed to be, they take the risks and they get the rewards, but there's no risks. They're just bailed out by the state. They're just bailed out by the state. Now, the other idea out there, now actually, and monetarism, I'll tell you why monetarism doesn't work. That you bail out the rich, you bail out the bankers, but you get that money from austerity, from cutting social programs, cutting healthcare, cutting education, cutting, and therefore you balance the budget. Well, the problem with that they did that in Greece. If you put through austerity and you cut back on the public sector and you cut back on services, well, then working class people, have no money to buy stuff. So you make the crisis worse, because working class, the market collapses because workers are just struggling to survive, and they only buy what they absolutely have to. And sometimes they don't even have the money to buy what they have to. That's what happened in Greece with austerity. Okay, but then you've got the Keynesianists. the Keynesianists who believe that the state needs to intervene and go into debt or even potentially tax the rich to create social programs or build public works. This is what happened also in the 1930s, between 1933 and 37, that there was the New Deal. That there's all these big ideas that we need new deals, Green New Deal, this New Deal, that other New Deal, and harking back to the 1930s as though this solved the crisis. Well, for a period, it got a certain fictitious economy going. There was growth between 33 and 37. But at the end of the day, once that government intervention was taken away, the economy went back into crisis. The economy went back into crisis. From 37 to 39, there was a new economic slump that the Keynesianist method did not work. And they also ended up being inflationary. It didn't actually solve the crisis of overproduction. It's inflationary because, okay, you go into debt, where are you going to get that money from? And eventually that debt needs to be paid back. Or you print money. Well, if you print money, that ends up being inflationary. Everybody ends up poorer, functionally poorer, because the prices of goods and services goes up and up and up and up, right? You saw that in Weimar Republic, Germany, where they were printing money, there was hyperinflation, and people were going around with wheelbarrows of money trying to spend it before it became worthless, right? That's the problem with printing money. So Keynesianism doesn't fundamentally solve the crisis of capitalism. Actually, it's named after a guy called John Maynard Keynes. And he wasn't a socialist. Actually, John Maynard Keynes said, in the class war, you will find me on the side of the enlightened bourgeoisie. His ideas, even though today the so-called left have taken up Keynesianist ideas, well, today, he was actually trying to save capitalism. There's nothing socialist about deficit financing. It's trying to save the capitalist economy. It's and the problem is, if you get the money from taxing the rich, for this, if you get the money for state investment from taxing the rich, and you keep the rich, the capitalists, in control of the economy, if you tax them, if you take the money away from them, they won't invest. That leads to a crisis in the economy if the capitalists do not invest. If you go into debt, well, that can work for a period, but it ends up having diminishing returns and needs to go into more and more and more and more into debt. And eventually debt servicing becomes the biggest government department. So it cannot be sustained. It cannot be sustained. Or finally, you don't tax the rich, you don't go into debt, instead you print money. Well, that eventually ends up as inflationary and leads to another explosion of class struggle. The Keynesianist methods of the post-war period led to hyperinflation in the 1970s and strike waves in country after country after country as workers were trying to get their wages to keep up with inflation. So this is the sort of crisis of the system. Now, what are the capitalists of today actually doing? Well, it's a combination of debt. It's a combination of all three, if you think about it. That they, on the one side, the Canadian government has put up a budget projection of something like $350 billion of deficit. That is the largest budget deficit in Canadian history. It is 17% of GDP is being added to the country's debt. And they say, oh, no, this isn't a problem because debt servicing is very cheap. Debt servicing is very cheap. And that is true right now, that there's very low interest rates. So, okay, debt servicing is cheap today. But eventually, if inflation kicks in, then those interest rates is going to start going up and the debt servicing will get a lot more expensive. So they can get away with it for a period of time. And actually, one of the reasons why the interest rates are so very low is that they're printing money. They're printing $5 billion every week of what they call quantitative easing. These Bank of Canada is buying government debt, which is functionally, it's creating money out of nothing, creating incredible bubbles, financial bubbles, and this hasn't been inflationary yet because nobody's buying anything, so there's really a deflationary pressure. But as soon as things start picking up, well, this reduced value of money because they've been printing money, well, that's going to lead to inflation. And then the government debt is going to be a lot more expensive to maintain. And then the other thing they're doing is bailouts. The right wing loves to talk about CERB, right? Giving people $2,000 a month and to just survive through the pandemic and not be forced to go into the most dangerous environments in the pandemic. They're making all of this noise about how dare you give working class people anything. Well, the value of CERB has been about $80 billion. But what they don't scream and yell about, all of these right-wing commentators who are so desperately concerned that you give anything to workers, and the idea, oh no, you're stop incentivizing people to work. So really, if $2,000 of subsistence pay is stopping people from coming to your workplace, then you're probably an extreme exploitative poverty employer, right? Try upping your wages for once, or providing a safe environment for your workers. Well, for that $80 billion for CERB, there's another $80 billion in forgivable loans to businesses. There's a similar amount in wage subsidies. And then they don't talk about this one. There is a $750 billion secret fund to bail out corporations. This is government money that they're not telling the people which corporations are being bailed out. And these are corporations that are giving dividends. These are corporations that are giving bonuses to their executives. And they are, the worst corporate welfare bums, right? And this itself is an indictment of capitalism. This shows that capitalism does not work because they are relying upon this government money to survive. For every dollar given to working class people to survive, there's been $10 given to the corporations. That's the present situation. But all of this is unsustainable. All of this is unsustainable. They're going to have to decide eventually. Somebody's going to have to pay. Somebody's going to have to pay. Is it the workers or is it the bosses? Because they cannot just keep racking up debt. Although the Globe and Mail said, who are traditionally a small c conservative paper, they actually issued an editorial saying, no, just rack up debt, doesn't matter. Debt doesn't matter. There were very high debts after the Second World War, and Canada and the other capitalist countries paid it off. Well, it was easy to pay it off when there was 5 to 6% annual growth rates for 20 years. But that is not on the horizon by any means. It's going, if there is going to be any growth, it's going to be 1%, 0%, -%. That's the future that we're facing. And there are no capitalist solutions. There's no monetarist solutions of austerity. There are no Keynesianist solutions of debt and money printing. The only solution is to tear it all up, to stop production for profit, and instead produce for need. You need to, who actually runs the economy? It is the working class. Who knows how to run the economy? It is the working class. You know, ask any billionaire on a yacht. Does he know how to build a drywall? I don't think so. Working class people know how to do that. Actually, the expertise to plan the economy, there's an interesting book called The People's Republic of Walmart that details how within Walmart and within Amazon and within Google and Apple and these major corporations that have revenues the size of G20 countries, that they are a pure planned economy within them. That there's no competition within them. They're a planned economy. They use the most advanced computer planning mechanisms to plan the economy. But the difference is they're planned for profit, private profit. Jeff Bezos has actually massively increased his wealth in this crisis. There's another example of the parasitism. While he's forcing all his workers to work minimum wage and not get bathroom breaks, and people fall dead, literally fall dead in his warehouses, and he's massively increased his wealth at the same time during the pandemic. There's a difference between now and 1929. There was great inequality in 1929. The 0.1 richest people controlled 25% of all wealth in 1929, and that's the same today. But the difference is after 1929, inequality went down. Now inequality is going up. That it'll be 30% and 35% the super rich control of the wealth of society. So working class people need to take over the economy democratically, run under workers' democracy, workers' control of production, a socialist planned economy. Working class people already know how to run society, and the technique exists. One of the problems of the Soviet Union was that the educational level of the working class was very low, and they had to rely upon privileged technicians and experts. But today, we've got the most overeducated working class in human history. For every 8 PhDs, there's only one job. So we've got incredible education of the working class that we don't need these capitalist parasites anymore. We can run society productively. We can close down what needs closing down in the pandemic and focus on essential services. So nobody needs to needlessly risk their health and safety. We can prioritize all the necessary personal protective equipment and other safety measures. A socialist society planning for need would have no problem with the pandemic. Absolutely not. We'd mobilize the teachers for small class sizes. We'd mobilize the nurses and the doctors to give people the care that they need. We would not have business secrets in creating the vaccine for the pandemic. We would not have that. We would release all of the information and pool all of the research to get the best science done in the shortest possible time. That's the idea behind a socialist society. That is the only solution. Ownership. You cannot control what you do, not own, and the workers need to take ownership of the commanding heights of the economy. And that's why we need a revolution. And that's what the International Marxist Tendency and Fight back of fighting for. So if you agree with this, join us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for that great presentation, Alex. It was very informative. So now we're going to move on to the discussion, just to let you guys know how it's going to work. Obviously, we're excited to hear from all of you. Some basic rules for this. So to speak, you'll need to raise your hand. You can use the raise hand function in Zoom. If you can't see the raise hand button, you can click on participants down at the bottom and then go to the side, and it should be at the bottom right of your screen. When you raise your hand, I'll put you on the speakers list. To speak, I'll ask you to turn on your camera. We want to simulate a real meeting as much as possible. So if you could also, when you start your comment or question, introduce your name and where in the country you're speaking from, that would be really good. And try to keep your comments between 3 to 5 minutes each so that everyone gets a chance to speak. And after the discussion, Alex will sum up for a bit and address any questions that weren't addressed in the discussion itself. I want to stress new people should speak. I'll be prioritizing you. There's no dumb questions. If you're thinking it, someone else is probably thinking it too. And I'll be prioritizing new people on the list and people who have not spoken before. So please don't be shy. While people figure out their cameras and how to make the raise hand button work, I'm going to make a bit of an appeal for our paper. I mentioned it earlier, but for people who came in late, we have a publication called Fight Back. It's a socialist publication. It's a grassroots publication. It's a workers' publication. We're a completely independent organization that doesn't get any donations from the capitalist class or the capitalist state. Instead, we get all of our money to organize from regular people like you. It allows us to publish our paper, which is a socialist perspective on the issues of the day, as well as to maintain our office in downtown Toronto, as well as in Montreal, and also to keep our full-time staff operating, people like Alex Grant, who you just heard speak. So if you like what you heard, you can support us by getting a Solidarity subscription at marxist.ca/subscription. A link in the chat will be posted shortly. And let's say you're a real go-getter. You're like, you know what, Adam? An article's not enough for me. I don't want no paper. I want books. Well, you're in luck. We have a bookstore. This bookstore has all of the classics from Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky, and publications from our own organization. And we'll post the link in the chat for that as well. So don't miss out on that. Get your books. Theory is an important part of the class struggle. So I see a lot of people have started to put their hands up. So now I will start calling on you guys. Just 1 second. Okay. So why don't we start with Sakif from Montreal? Sakif, I'll unmute you right now.
Hello? Yeah, you guys can hear me? Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Adam. Let me begin by thanking Alex for that excellent lead off. And secondly, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend this session tonight. I wanted to come in on this theme that's been mentioned a bit, which is this conflict between profit in the capitalist system and the production for human need. And I thought I'd use 2 relevant examples to illustrate what Marxists might call a contradiction in the system. The first example comes from the race to find a coronavirus vaccine. As many of you are aware, many different countries, in particular, many different pharmaceutical companies are, they're off to the races to find a vaccine. And what happened was that, a couple of months ago, you had this brief uptick in the stock market based on the hopes that a vaccine would be found. In other words, the stock prices of different pharmaceutical companies went up. What does this mean? What does it mean when the stock price goes up? Does it mean there's more wealth? Does it mean society is better off? You can't eat stocks. The stock price going up isn't going to pay your rent for you. That's because stocks, what they represent is they represent claims on future profits. When you see these things happen, like the stock price for different pharma companies goes up, it means that investors and speculators on Wall Street, they think that the pharma company is going to make money. But in the context of the current pandemic, this means that the pharma companies would profit off of working people who desperately need a vaccine so they can keep going to work and maintain their livelihoods to keep feeding their families. And I would say that this represents a massive drain on the wealth of society where it counts. Because, you know, if your wages are already gone down and now you have to pay this extra fee just to, you know, inoculate yourself against this disease, it means you have less money to spend on things that actually matter, like food and education and all those other things that Alex mentioned in his lead-up. And let's be clear, these drugs are usually expensive because big pharma companies have monopolies on them. Another example that I want to bring up is that other ongoing societal catastrophe, climate change. As I'm sure many of you know, there are unprecedented wildfires raging on the American West Coast. And scientists have linked the frequency and scale of these wildfires to worsening global warming. As many of you also know, the technical means to greatly reduce global warming are available to us. We could transform much of our production to use renewable energy, and we could build smart electric grids across the nation and across the world to distribute the energy from wind and solar. And such a transition would also provide good, high-quality jobs, building the green infrastructure that's actually necessary to get us out of our climate crisis. So why hasn't this transition happened? The answer is simple. The moment we start transitioning, there would be an immediate negative effect on the profits of the capitalists who own the oil and gas companies and the fossil fuel infrastructure. There would almost certainly be a stock market crash, even worse than what we already have. But a green transition would obviously represent an increase of wealth where it counts, you know, in terms of like creating good, high quality jobs, saving the environment, giving more and more people the ability to provide their basic human needs. And there's a similarity in both of these cases, you know, the race to find a coronavirus vaccine and the transition away from fossil fuels. And it's that all the technical means are available to us for these things that are very clearly, you know, like that most of the people on the surface of this earth need. The missing ingredient is a society-wide planning of the economy that is able to execute a plan that benefits the vast majority of us, i.e. the working class. And I'd like to just end my intervention on this point. You know, sometimes theories like Marxist economics, all this talk of like profit and surplus and inflation and interest rates, they can seem a bit difficult and abstract. But Marxism and socialism aren't just ideas to be discussed by scholars in their ivory towers. Socialism is not a question of abstract preference. It's a necessity that arises out of the concrete material situation we face right now. To give you an example, you know, if your house was on fire, having a fire hose nearby is not a question of abstract preference, it's a necessity. It would be insane in that situation to either ignore the fire or just try to put out some of it and hope for the best. It's equally irrational to think that we can confine ourselves to the narrow limits of capitalism, especially after everything that's happened in this year alone. And bourgeois economics or mainstream economics is, you know, the intellectual reflection of this decrepit and irrational capitalist system, and it's why it's unable to explain anything. It's why the pundits and all the economists who get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, they can't predict recessions, they can't predict depressions, and they're frankly at a loss for anything. On the other hand, Marxism represents a rational way of understanding the world, and on the basis of a clear understanding of how the world actually works, to build a rational mode of production, i.e. socialism. But to build socialism as an economic system that works not for profit but for human need, and to keep Marxism alive as a living theory, that's not going to happen on its own. That requires the conscious intervention of the masses, of the working class, of people like you and me. Therefore, for those of you who have not done so already, I urge you to join us so we can achieve socialism in our lifetime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sakif. I have Jackie next. I'm going to unmute you, Jackie, and then followed by Fatima.
Hello, thank you so much. I don't have an intervention per se. I just have a question that I've been thinking about for a while, and I'd love to hear feedback from others. I am aware of the ultra wealthy family of the Westons who are now acquiring more and more companies and exploiting more and more workers, especially during the pandemic, to increase their wealth even more than before the pandemic, and refusing emergency pay after a few months and so on. How are we to address this situation? So as a professor in the university, I want to be able to engage with students on these conversations when we talk about globalization and health, or the health and society, which are some of the topics that I talk about, sociology of food and eating. How do I talk with students to politicize them, to activate, and to actually help to inspire them to take action in this, but could also be many different examples? I appreciate any feedback others have. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question. I have Fatima next, followed by Laura. I will unmute right now. Hang on. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello? Okay, cool. So I'd like to thank Alex as well for the presentation. I found it very educational. There are many ways that the crisis of capitalism presents itself, and it affects different populations in different ways. And today I'm going to be talking about how the crisis of capitalism affects migrant workers. For the vast majority of people, I'm sure we all know, capitalism is horror without end. But among those who bear the burdens of the system the most, and who experience almost unprecedented levels of workplace abuse and exploitation, are migrant workers. As of 3 years ago, there were about 500,000 temporary foreign workers in Canada, accounting for 3% of the total population. And though the overall percentage might not seem like a large amount, they are significantly overrepresented in agriculture. 42% of the workforce in the agricultural sector in Ontario, and over 30% in the same sector in Quebec, British Columbia, and Nova Scotia. And on a global scale, we're talking about 164 million migrant laborers worldwide. But the numbers alone, they don't tell you much. They don't tell you the whole story. Why does capitalism, particularly in the advanced countries, so heavily rely on a reserve army of migrant labor? Because it is disproportionately the advanced capitalist world, North America, Western Europe, the Arab Gulf states, that you see an influx of these kinds of workers. And why is that? You find the answers once you look at the conditions that these workers are forced to live in. Payment of lower wages than agreed upon, with no payment for overtime, illegal deduction from wages. And if the COVID-19 crisis has shown us anything, it's that migrant workers, with the little protections afforded to them, are the first to be sent to die in a situation like this. Canadian capitalists and capitalists worldwide are completely okay exposing these workers to significant health and safety risks that the pandemic poses, and endangering the rest of the Canadian population in the process. I mean, just look at what happened in Windsor, Essex, and Norfolk County in Ontario, where migrant workers were being packed in their overcrowded bunkhouses and workplaces like sardines, leading to the deaths of some workers already. And migrant workers will regularly be demanded to perform duties not agreed upon in their contract, will be denied medical care and other bread and butter benefits, and regularly face the threat of deportation. For women, the story is even more gruesome. Most of the women workers are employed in domestic labor, where staggering amounts will face outright physical or sexual abuse from their employers, but do not report it for fear of losing their only source of income, since capitalism does not provide another way out for most of these workers. And so the answer is clear. The reason that capitalism is so reliant on migrant labor is because in order to remain profitable, in order for the rich to keep getting richer, there needs to be a way to drive wages down the lowest they can go, a way to cut out as many expenses as possible. And they're not going to take it out of their own pockets. They're going to make the workers pay. This requires there to be a super exploited layer in society to bear the brunt of this need. And migrant workers account for a large number. And just an indication of how migrant workers, in the eyes of the capitalists, represent an opportunity to expand profits, one Silicon Valley technology company in Fremont, California, paid less than $2 per hour to skilled migrant workers from India who are working up to 122 hours per week, installing computers when the average wage for the job they were employed in was $20 per hour. And even worse, when you calculate the overtime they were putting in, they should have been getting paid $44 per hour. So these are incredible figures. And if you take this one example and you apply it to the conditions of the 164 million workers worldwide, you can understand how essential to profits this is from the capitalist perspective, and particularly in times of crisis. And so it's only by fighting against capitalism that we can hope to fight against the degradation and dehumanization of the world's migrant labor force. And it's only under socialism that we can have a truly international society that treats its members with dignity. And so thank you, comrades. I look forward to fighting this fight with you.
Thank you. I have Laura next, followed by Bezat. I will unmute you now, Laura, 1 second. There you go.
Hello. I just wanted to ask if you could explain the concept of constant capital, because I'm a bit confused about it, or someone, whoever follows up. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. And I have Bezad next. I'm going to unmute you right now.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Hello? Yeah, okay. Jackie had a good question, which Fatima's evidence and research actually gave me an idea. You see, when migrant workers come to different countries and aren't paid enough money, it's very interesting, because recently I was reading about how colonialism was done the same way. You were brought slaves from other countries, and one of the things that we socialists like to argue is that this is modern slavery. Basically, it's a modern slavery based on some laws that make you think you're not a slave, but you're a free person. So I found a very good, they almost seem the same. You bring the slaves over, you bring migrant workers over. They don't have as much rights. They're not being paid as much. I feel like one way for a professor like Jackie to open up to her students would be to state something as bluntly as this and then have evidence for it. That's maybe one way to do it. Of course, we're open to more ideas. It's just something at the top of my head. Also, yeah, this is all I wanted to add for now. So keep going, guys.
Thank you for that, Bezad. I just wanted to make one more appeal to people. You know, if you're new, if this is your first meeting, you know, you've never come to anything like this before, don't hesitate to raise your hand and share your thoughts. You know, any questions are welcomed, or any comments are welcomed. So don't be too shy. And I'll give you a minute to raise your hands if you want. Just wait a few minutes here. Let people work up their courage. I know usually people don't get to speak in front of 100 people. You know, it can be very nerve-wracking, but I promise, you know, it's not that bad. You know, no one's gonna bite. Okay. A few people raised their hands. Okay, I have Sarah from Victoria. I'll unmute you now, and you can give us your thoughts.
I just have questions. I just started learning about Marxism. Really, I have a vague idea about things, but I'm trying to understand what it would more literally look like in terms of economics in day-to-day lives for people. Like, I understand why capitalism sucks. It sucks. It's horrible. Actually, I was listening to Fatima say, it really reminded me too, some of the reasons why, just as a comment, I used to work on a, like as a volunteer position on a board for repatriating people who'd been, illegally trafficked into Russia. And it was like just, it was mostly people from like Africa. And yeah, it was just the level of, that you could use people like that and take advantage of people who are in just such a harder position. And I think that is one of the things about capitalism that scares. There's no control over who gets to make the decisions over all of these people's lives, and it's terrifying. So that said, though, what are we trying to offer people? Like, I really want to be able to have better conversations with people, and I feel like I know why capitalism is bad. I don't feel like I completely can articulate to people why what this vision of our Marxist society would be like enough to really sell that.
That was a great question. Thank you, Sarah. And I think we need more, questions like that, because these are some, good questions that everyone has when thinking about socialism. This isn't something that you're taught every day. So next up, I have Maria. So I will unmute you now.
Can everybody hear me all right? All right, I don't have it. I'm going to assume y'all said yeah. Hi, I'm Maria. I'm actually not anywhere near, I'm breaking up. This will probably help my internet connection. Is that with you guys? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead.
Okay, so I had a couple, I wrote down actually a bunch of things, and I'm not sure if this is the right section. I'm not sure if we're going to be doing like a good and welfare section. It's a mix of my own personal questions, answers to other people's questions, and just kind of building on certain topics, and then a couple of other comments. So I'll start with my responses to Jackie, the educator. I went to college for education. I have found that the best way to engage students of all ages is to come at it with a holistic approach. And I know that sounds corny. I don't mean it in a corny way. I mean it in a way that where you relate it to their personal life. Show them exactly how whatever it was we were talking about, how capitalism or whatever is terrible, or whether or not socialism would make their lives better. Try and like pick up on like when they talk about something like healthcare, or well, you're in Canada, but regardless, try and relate it to their own life. And then to Sarah, I highly recommend you look up the EZLN. They are the Zapatistas who have been running the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico since 1994, the end of it, I believe. And they are a directly democratic, horizontally structured government, and they even run for president now and everything. So those are my two responses. I wanted to know, my one question for the leaders is, what are the membership numbers for this organization worldwide, or just North America? I don't care, and get back to me on that whenever. And then I want to build on some of the things that Alex, the first presenter, lecturer, said about how workers are the ones that know how to run everything. We're self-sufficient. Look at how look at all the things that the Inca built, Machu Picchu, all that jazz. They built that because they had no currency. They paid their taxes in labor. That's how they built that. And then also North America's economy is almost entirely the service industry now, and the people consuming the service industry are the people who got freaking eat, which are normal folks. And as somebody who searches more and richer people, they really don't, they mess with like one person, whereas regular working class people, they go out more often, and that gets spread around to the rest of the working class.
Maria, your internet is cutting out a little bit.
It looks like my last thing is just kind of a side thought that I noticed when I was scrolling through the 130 odd names was that a lot of you all, instead of using your location, use your geographic, instead of using your geographic location, you use your school name. And like I saw U of A, U of B, U of C, a lot of different places that I did not know whatsoever. And that seems a little exclusionary to me, and is honestly just also kind of confusing. And then my last question, which is not a question for my own self, it's just more of a like conversation to start, is, aren't we already a democracy though? What do you mean starting something running democracy? Was any of it intelligible? If none of it was understandable, then just move on to the next person.
Yeah, I think we should move on because Zoom was doing something weird. It lagged a bit, I think. So the next person that I have on the list is Joel, followed by Athena from Belleville. So I'll unmute Joel first. Just one moment. Well, oh, hang on. Sorry, he has a different account. Here we go. Okay. Joel, are you there? Okay, while Joel figures his situation out, we'll move on to Athena. And we'll go from there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I just had a quick note. So I'm a DSW right now, so a developmental service worker. And so I work with people with different intellectual disabilities. And from what I've noticed is like many of them could, if they were given the opportunity, could work. But under this current system of capitalism, they like a lot of their work wouldn't be seen as profitable. Provide valuable contributions. They're just not as profitable, so they don't give them the opportunities. And as so, the amount of money that they're given to survive on per month is it's not enough. And I see it every day. And so that was just my comment. Under the current capitalist system, it's just people at the edges of society, they aren't given enough to survive on as it is. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Joel next, so I will unmute him now. If it works, there we go.
There we go. I think that worked this time. Hello, everyone. I'm obviously not Sarah. I am Joel. Anyway, yeah, I would like to, I'm an activist with Fightback here in Montreal. I'd like to come in on the question that, I can't remember who asked it, but about, yes, it's all well and good to sit here and denounce capitalism. I think there's millions and millions, probably hundreds of millions of people that are fairly consciously aware of this is a really bad system. It doesn't work so well. We could list 1,000,001 reasons why, but it's not enough to know what you don't want. You have to know what you want and why. And I think that is important for us. We did have an event on this, and I see that the link has been posted in the chat there, so I encourage people to watch it. But just a couple of things. I mean, I think Marx talked about how within the womb of capitalism is created the embryo of socialism. And I think we see that more and more every day. So socialism is not some sort of utopian plan that Marx devised, and he was just some genius. Although I do believe he was a genius of sorts. It actually came out of his conclusion about socialism came out of his analysis of capitalism, which is why we focus on that, and the development of the working class. And the working class is a class that is the only class ever that has played such a social role in production. Everyone working together in a massive chain in the world economy and in big factories and big companies together to produce these commodities. That workers end up developing a socialist consciousness, like a class consciousness, a collective consciousness that doesn't exist or doesn't get created at that level psychologically amongst other classes, like the peasants or small business people who end up being a bit more, or the bourgeoisie especially, end up being quite individualistic because they're looking out for their own interests. But Marx famously said that the working class goes from being a class in itself, sort of being like an objective socioeconomic category that we can, analytically observe, to a class for itself, in that under the hammer blows of capitalist exploitation and oppression, workers start to realize more and more that they're working class, and that and I think this isn't events like this, and there's these things happening all over the place, more and more people realizing this. So that makes it that makes a new form of society possible. Now, onto the question about what is it exactly? Well, I think you can see it both within the organization of the working class, in things like trade unions, in any strike, in any factory occupation, even in some forms of cooperatives, you see working class people trying to take control of their society. You saw it in the Russian Revolution, you saw it in the Spanish Revolution, you saw it in many revolutions. You see this embryonic form arise of workers' councils, of economic planning, even in Canadian history. Not a lot of people know about that, but in 1919, during the Winnipeg General Strike, you can look up pictures of it. You had pictures of milk trucks, because they used to deliver milk. Yes, that was a thing. And they would have by authorization of the strike committee. So this was actually the workers they would authorize, okay, the hospital can be open, we'll turn on power for these. And so the workers were actually determining how the city would be run, partially. It didn't go the full way, obviously, because we don't live in socialism in Canada, unfortunately. And I think, Alex mentioned so the question, I guess the question would be, can like workers' control of production and economic planning, is that viable? Does that work? Didn't it fail? Well, Alex mentioned the book The Republic of Walmart, which I think is generally a decent book, and I recommend it, a good book. Which the authors go through detail about how not only through the working class, like trade unions and things like Bailouts and Embryo of Socialism, but even the capitalists themselves create the preconditions for socialism, for a planned economy. That a company like Walmart, or especially Walmart, Walmart has a GDP, if you can say that it has a GDP, because it's not a country, but it has a GDP bigger than most countries on the world. And Walmart owns the entire, they own the production, the transportation, the distribution, the sales, the service, the warehouses. They own the whole line, the whole chain. A lot of companies, Amazon is similar. And basically what this means is that the entire, a big chunk of the economy is entirely planned internally. Now, it's not democratically planned. So the book, The Republic of Walmart, goes into detail about how actually the capitalists are proving by their own actions that economic planning is superior to the market. And if you want to know how the market fails, well, Sears is a good example. I don't know if people know the example of Sears, but Sears actually had a libertarian CEO that took over about 15, 20 years ago. And what he did is he made all of the different Sears branches compete with each other and have to get contracts with each other, like capitalism. It was an amazing market. What happened is, well, I don't know, is Sears around? It tanked massively. So the market actually isn't very productive or efficient. Capitalism centralizes, because centralization and plans internally, because in the big conglomerates, because it's more progressive, it's more efficient, it works better. All that socialists argue is that the working class, which is starting to struggle, and you see this in strikes, you see this in mass movements, especially in the country like the US, should democratically control these things. That's why Alex said the main levers of economy. So I don't know, I didn't go super into detail about it, but this is sort of the general thing about what would socialism look like. I mean, I can't tell you, oh, once the worker sees power in 20 years, we'll have this, and that, and the other thing. I mean, it's never really happened, in my opinion. So we can only look at some historic examples and look at what currently exists in our society and theorize that, man, capitalism is bad. And I am convinced that socialism is possible. I'm convinced it is possible for working class people like ourselves to democratically plan the economy on a massive scale. Planning is already done in the big conglomerates, as I was talking about. I believe that therefore it can be done democratically for the benefit of humanity and for the planet, basically. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Joel. We're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to ask people to keep their interventions to 3 minutes if possible. Next, we have Chad from Calgary, followed by Nasha.
Hello. Also new to the whole thing, I just have a question. I've heard people reference the idea that Marxism or socialism is like anti-oppression or anti-oppressive. And I just have a question about what that looks like, what makes Marxism inherently anti-oppressive. And if we were to transition to socialism tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now, how does a population shift its attitude regarding oppression? We've been fed this us versus them bullshit for years, and people internalize that. So if put in the hands of the workers or the people, what happens when the people are shitty and still treat people poorly? And what kind of piece is built into Marxism or socialism that would work to protect people? Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent question. Next we have Nasha, so I'll unmute her right now, followed by Mohit.
Thank you. Adam, can you just let me know if I go on too long? Thank you. So I wanted to talk a bit about UBI, Universal Basic Income. It's a topic that has become extremely popular on both the left and the right. And so on the surface, this idea of an unconditional minimum income can seem like something very common sense for the left to advocate for. And the fact that so many people, not just leftists, are raising this demand can be seen as a positive instinct of the working class that, yeah, we do deserve a decent minimum standard of living. But I want to explain why this is not a working class demand, because if we scratch the surface even a little bit, and we ask the question, in whose interest is the solution of a UBI, we can see that at least left on its own, it is not a demand socialists should actually be putting forward. So the idea behind UBI is based on a failing capitalist economy, as Alex outlined. Workers who are being made increasingly redundant would have a safety net, and the idea is that it would lift people out of poverty. And to be clear, Marxists are not against reforms. We are at the forefront of fighting for real improvements of the conditions of the working class. But in an era of the worst economic crisis in capitalism's history, it is quite utopian to think that this reform will actually improve the lives of working class people. So first of all, as I mentioned, UBI is not inherently a left-wing measure. For the right wing who advocate for it, this is a replacement for the welfare state, a solution to reducing expensive bureaucracy, government interference in the market, right? And left on its own, UBI is just a subsidy for the capitalists, right? We're still paying rent, we're paying for utilities, food. So without any other measures, for example, rent control, control on utilities, etc., that money is just a transfer of wealth from the government, which is our taxes, right? We're paying for that. It's a transfer of wealth to the landlords and the capitalists who own and control housing, food, and all other goods and services in the economy, right? And this takes away the responsibility of the capitalist bosses to pay fair wages. What they give with one hand, they will take away with the other. Actually, Ford scrapped the UBI kind of project as well, right? So it's just kind of the whim of whichever politicians come and go. Yeah, so again, it's important to look at this demand concretely, not in the abstract. In whose class interest is it being proposed? So in many cases, it's not only is it not a viable reform, but in many cases, it can be put forward as a counter reform, right? To gut all the social programs that the labor movement has won in the past. And so the question with any reform under capitalism is who pays, right? Alex talked about this. Where is the money coming from? So we all know that more than enough wealth exists to ensure that no one lives in poverty. We know that 8 people own as much wealth as half the world combined. We know that the richest countries in the world are sitting on idle piles of cash in the billions and the trillions. But does any of that, like even today, right? There's well-meaning leftists who suggest UBI can be funded through an increase in taxes on the wealthiest individuals and corporations. But already the capitalists don't pay their taxes. Why do we think that will work, right? But I'd say the number one limitation, and I see I have a minute left, so I'm just going to wrap up real quick. The number one limitation of the demand for UBI is that it does absolutely nothing to challenge the capitalist system itself, which is the reason for the misery, the degradation of the lives of the majority of people. And that is why it's so palatable across the political spectrum. From the reformist labor leaders to right-wing libertarians that have been putting this demand forward. And the reason it's so palatable is because far from being a product of the class struggle, it's a distraction from the class struggle. It blunts the developing revolutionary consciousness of the masses that we see very clearly today. And so while the leaders of the labor movement are pushing for a UBI, what they should be pushing for is the call for decent wages, full employment for all, through nationalization under workers' control of industry. The capitalists actually benefit from a section of the population being constantly unemployed, which puts okay, sorry, I'm being told to wrap up. 1 second. I'll just end here. Right, so this focus, this hyper focus on redistribution of wealth rather than on production, the antagonism between who owns and controls the wealth, which is the capitalists, versus who produces it, the workers. It takes all the teeth out of revolutionary Marxism. It leaves out the very essence of it and makes it a question of saving capitalism rather than overthrowing it. So in a time where the class struggle is heightening and revolutionary movements are erupting around the world, socialists need to put forward revolutionary solutions that the masses are looking for, and a firm grasp and understanding of Marxist economics, the fundamental mechanisms and contradictions of the capitalist system is really crucial in helping us shape these demands. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nasha. That was good. I have Mohit next. Mohit, do you mind turning on your camera when I unmute you, which I will do now?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for asking. First of all, I do agree that there are a lot of issues with capitalism, and I think Karl Marx excellently presented those issues in his book Das Kapital, and like I think Alex also discussed most of them. So I definitely with this point, but I sort of corroborate Sarah's point that we know there are criticisms with capitalism, but I think as Karl Marx himself, philosophers have interpreted the world, now it's time to kind of change it. So that change requires scrupulous thinking and also sophisticated framework, that the way by which we can implement those changes. And somehow I feel I'm not an economic student also. So I'm just a mature economist, but I feel that I haven't got those answers properly through the readings I've been doing thus far. So I seriously want to discuss a few of them, and maybe Alex at the end can enlighten me on those aspects. For example, even Marxist, they wrote a critique against this Marxist theory of falling price value, or what you call falling rate of profit. And they say that there are some intrinsic criticism associated with its theory of values. So there is some implement that economy as well, liberal as well as Marxist. Second, faulty values or market pricing mechanism, it offers us a way to efficiently utilize the resources. I do not, at least I'm not aware of a way by which a centralized system where like a single government is controlling all the resources.
Sorry, Mohit, your internet is lagging a bit too much. But I think Alex got the crux of your question, so he'll reply to it in the sum up. Next, I have Marissa. So I'm going to unmute you now.
Hi. Yeah, so I just wanted to respond to Chad's question about what makes Marxism inherently anti-oppression. And I think that, comes down to, the fact that Marxism is about a class analysis of society, and that, the only power that the working class has is its unity. The capitalists, they control the state, they have a monopoly on violence, control over the media and education, and they have all the money. And workers just have the fact that we're the ones who actually run things. But we can really only put that power to use if we're united. So we have an interest in, fighting for one another and in building that unity across, the entire working class, no matter what other divisions might exist. Moreover, there's a saying in the labor movement that an injury to one is an injury to all. That's because when one sector of the working class is weak, it weakens the class as a whole as well. So for example, like if women are paid less, then that actually acts as a downward pressure on everyone's wages. So it's in the interest of male workers to fight for women to be paid better. And it's just it's in the interest of capitalism to perpetuate sexism amidst workers so that this isn't immediately obvious. Yeah, so that's just a very quick answer to that question.
Thank you, Marissa. So we're rapidly running out of time. We have time for maybe one or two more interventions, but just so people know, after Alex is done summing up, we're going to stay and have breakout rooms where you'll be able to ask your questions to, comrades and people in the organization, as well as Alex himself. So stick around. For those of you who didn't get to ask your questions or discuss, there's going to be more discussion after we're finished. So don't worry about that. I have Andy Winger next. I'm going to unmute you now.
Hey, yeah. Hi, I'm in Minneapolis. Sorry, I forgot to put that up there. But yeah, I just wanted to quickly, reply to the question of, I guess, the vision of a socialist society in a sense. It's kind of hard for socialists sometimes to answer because there's no laid out plan. It really has to be, built in struggle. But, people definitely have visions. I think the easiest way to think about it is you think about a world without profit. So in a sense, think about all the things that profit limits. So in a world where production is based on profit, you have low wages. In the US, we have high healthcare costs. We have racism perpetuated to push down the working classes, wages, and sexism, like what just was spoke on. So basically, if you have this world that doesn't have profit, you have the ability for people to work less hours, to have higher quality of life, have, education, food, housing, health care provided for you, because workers produce all the wealth in society. It's just that we don't own the wealth. We produce it and it's owned by a small minority. So what we're basically saying is we want to eliminate that transaction so that no longer a small minority gets to hoard all the wealth that we produce. Instead, we produce that wealth and share it amongst the majority of people. So really, in that sense, this is also why it's tied to anti-oppression and so forth, because it's basically a step forward in progress and production that it needs to be against oppression in order for us to achieve what we want. And we're able to use the technology that we have now. Like in capitalism, you have technology that replaces workers' jobs, whatever it is, self-checkout lines or something like that. And that can severely damage people's livelihood. In socialism, you can have self-checkout lines, you can have technology replace those types of jobs that aren't necessary, because it doesn't replace people's having their needs met. They're able to do things that they would rather do, whether it's be an artist or be a scientist or build houses or whatever it is, So essentially, I think the short answer to that is just try to imagine all the things that profit limits and holds back, and then see how you can expand in a world without it. And then just real quick to about safeguarding basically against corruption, I think, a big thing is the democratic control, the means of production, having workers' councils and having, people, representatives not paid a higher wage than a regular worker, being able to be instantly recalled. There's certain things like really, I'd read State and Revolution by Lenin to really kind of look at how you can safeguard against corruption in a socialist society. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Andy. And that'll be our last intervention. I'm going to hand it back to Alex. But before I do that, just so people know, we are going to have breakout rooms right after this so that you can discuss in there. And one other thing as well, in case people leave before the sum up, we are having an intervention at a rally that the Canadian Federation of Students is holding on September 30th. We will link the Facebook page in the chat for all of the details, but I encourage all of you to come out. It's going to be an exciting time, and it's important in these times that we're out there in the movement, trying to bring these ideas to the masses. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Alex. I'll unmute him now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for participating in this fantastic discussion. And I've got an impossible task of trying to respond to everybody, but I'll do my best. I've only got about 10 minutes to do that. But I'll start with Mohit's question, and made the fantastic statement that of Marx, that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And that's why we're organizing this. That is absolutely why we are organizing this, to change society. That we have to understand capitalism, not for academic purposes. We want to understand capitalism because we are sick and tired of this system, and it has to go. And if you are a doctor, if you're an oncologist, and you want to get rid of cancer, then you need to understand cancer very, very well so you can cut it out with a scalpel. But Mohit asked two other questions, and I think I got the second one. The first one was about the concept of the rate of profit. So I emphasized in my talk the crisis of overproduction, which in my view is the fundamental crisis of capitalism, the tendency for productive capacity to increase at a faster rate than the market is capable of buying back those products. And I think that's the fundamental crisis of capitalism. But there is another tendency, it does exist, and Marx talked about it, of the tendency of rate of profit to fall. And that actually relates to Laura's question of what is constant capital. So I try and combine these two questions. Constant capital is raw materials and machinery, right? And the tendency of capitalist investment, the capitalist cycle, is the capitalists, they take the surplus, they have a party with a bunch of it, but for the bits that they reinvest in better and more efficient machinery and technique. And with that machinery, they don't need as many workers to produce the commodities that were previously produced. So there is a tendency of, and in terms of production, is an increased weight falls upon machinery, constant capital, and a reducing weight is on human labor, a new human labor. Marx talked about this, about the dead labor of machinery dominates living labor of the worker. And there's that general tendency. But all the profits, all surplus value comes from new human labor. So the tendency is for the rate of profit to go down as you're using more machinery and fewer human beings. And so as you've got more constant capital and less variable capital, that's the tendency. But the reason why we emphasize overproduction, that even when you've got a very low rate of profit, that you can still get quite a large mass of profit if there's large production. And if everything is sold at its value, the capitalist will still be making a profit, even if it's at a low rate. You really need overproduction, which means there's more supply than the demand, to get the eradication of all profits and capitalist crisis. So hope that answers that. And then I think Mohit asked about centralization, and I think he was talking about bureaucratic control and Stalinism. And that's why our form of socialism is a democratic socialism, a bottom-up socialism with workers' democracy, workers' control of production, a democratically decided plan of production where the workers own the commanding heights of the economy. That's absolutely vital. And the reason why Stalinism collapsed was actually the lack of workers' democracy. That 50 bureaucrats in Moscow, well, maybe they can plan basic industrialization. You need so much steel, so many railroads, so much corn and wheat, etc. But once the Soviet economy got incredibly complex in the 1970s, that this could not be bureaucratically planned. And there's the weight of inefficiency and nepotism and bureaucratism and bribery and corruption became so much that the Soviet economy stagnated. And what it needed was workers' control. It needed to get rid of these Stalinist bureaucrats and instead have bottom-up democratic workers' control. Trotsky talked about workers' control and workers' democracy being the oxygen of a planned economy. So that's what we base ourselves upon. So a centrally planned economy, yes, but democratically decided by the whole of society. Okay. Chad asked, how would a socialist society, how would Marxism deal with oppression? Well, you know why racism and sexism and all of these other oppressions exist? The fundamental reason why they exist under capitalism or class society is because they are profitable. Malcolm X said that you can't get racism or capitalism without racism. It's built in its DNA. If they can set worker against worker, it's incredibly profitable. Where it is against the interests of all workers, such oppressive attitudes. That's why the capitalists put so much effort into dividing worker against worker. So a socialist society, well, we would, first of all, remove that economic base of oppression, that economic base of racism. Now, that doesn't end oppression overnight. No, oh my God, no. I wish it did. It doesn't end it overnight. But it removes the economic preconditions of these things, and we can mobilize the educational resources so that hopefully within a generation or two, that all of these oppressive attitudes will wither away. When there's no economic compulsion, there's no need for a ruling class to instill these oppressive attitudes, and we use the education system to end oppressive attitude. So it's a really, you cannot end oppression while capitalism still exists. It's built into the DNA, the oppression of women, racial oppression, gender oppression, all of it. It's built into the system. If you wish to eradicate this evil, you need to fight for socialism and build a socialist society. And the act of fighting against oppression unites working class people and makes them understand that they've got more in common with each other than they have with the bosses of all different races. Okay. Other questions? Athena, who's a social worker who worked with people with disability. And I think that was an excellent question, and really highlights the difference between a society that produces for profit, the capitalist society, and a society that produces for need, a socialist society. Capitalism is ridiculous. Millions and millions of people sit idle, unemployed. This is an indictment of the system. There are millions of people who could be productive, and not just people with disabilities are perfectly capable of being productive members of society. Absolutely, there is something everybody can add. Absolutely, there is something that everybody can add. But the logic of capitalism is you pay people the minimum and you extract the maximum profit. That's how the capitalists maximize, their profits. But we're not concerned with maximizing profit. We're concerned with maximizing the well-being of all of society. And it makes no sense to have 10, 20, 30% of the population sitting idle because a capitalist cannot profit from them. But a socialist society produces a need. Everybody can contribute something. And everybody can have a meaning contribution to society. Right? I think you'd have to be very, very sick before you cannot contribute to society. And society has an obligation to look after the sick, the old, the young, which capitalism doesn't care about either. Or the environment, I may add. Capitalism doesn't care about the environment, whereas a socialist society that produces for need will absolutely, it makes no sense to destroy the environment if you're producing for need. We need the environment. We live in it, for Christ's sake. So this is the logic of production for need. And I'll end up with, Sarah from Victoria asked, what would socialism look like? Yes, we had the other session on that. So I recommend that people check out the video on that. But it's advancing democracy to all parts of life. So at the moment, you have a distorted, not really democratic political system in some countries that you get to elect which part of the ruling class represents you for 4 or 5 years, and doesn't matter who you vote for, the bosses always win. But that's the political system. But economically, we all live in an absolutist dictatorship. There is no economic democracy under capitalism. And if you speak out, what happens? You get fired. It is there is absolutely no democratic say. So we want, what would socialism look like? Workers' democracy, workers' control of production. People know how to run society. We will advance lifelong education so we can become excellent at it. The skills already exist. The example of Walmart and Amazon and the rest of them, the incredible planning exists, but we want it democratic controlled. That's what socialism would look like. And I'll end up with Jackie's question of how to politicize students. And what about the injustice of the Western family? Yeah, it's disgusting. Galen Weston has, I think, a wealth of over $8 billion. He's the third richest man in Canada, owns Loblaws, and at the same time, they've been making sickening profits during the pandemic, as everybody has had no choice but to sort of buy from his supermarkets, and they're cutting the hero pay. What did Galen Weston do? He's done nothing, utterly nothing. He's a parasite, total parasite. He's a classic example of the capitalist class, profiteering off the misery of his workers and of the desperate need of the population. I think you can just tell that to your students. Look at this situation. Who works? Who creates this wealth? Is it Galen Weston? Did Galen Weston do a single little thing to create any of this wealth? Or was it actually the workers in that who are normally treated terribly and have been treated terribly and insulted by removing their hero pay, which itself wasn't enough? These are the people who run society. So yeah, Jackie, say that to your students. However, I would say, don't worry too much about having to politicize your students. All the statistics show that young people are overwhelmingly far to the left and more radical than people of my generation. I'm a Gen Xer. And so the youth will show us the way. The youth will absolutely show us the way. And the question is not, how do I politicize people? The question is, again, what Mohit brought up, how to change society. How to change society. And to change society, you need an organization. As individuals, we are merely raw material for exploitation. But as part of an organization, we have power. So I hope, Jackie, you will work with our organization and help us get in touch with students in the Okanagan to build revolutionary groups on your campus. Because we are building revolutionary groups on every campus and in many, many workplaces across Canada and across the world. That the international Marxist tendency is marching forward. We had a fantastic international school with, I think, was it 6,000 people participating just a month or so ago. That people are looking for the ideas to change society more and more and more. People adopting the ideas of socialism, and young people especially. The opinion polls show that massively. Even in the United States of America, the belly of the beast of a global capitalist imperialism, that people are looking for revolutionary change. And our organization has been marching forward internationally and in Canada. And I really appeal to everybody, learn why capitalism has failed, learn about the socialist solution, and join the Marxists to provide a better world for all of humanity so we don't have to continue with all of this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was an excellent send-off, and I hope everyone enjoyed the event. So usually, if this was in the real world, pre-COVID, we would go to a bar or a pub and sit down and chat some more. So we're going to try to simulate that with breakout rooms. Before we break into those, I want to make one last appeal. If you are not subscribed to our paper and you like what you heard here today, it's an excellent way to get the news of the day in a socialist format. Get the socialist perspective on what's going on in Canada and around the world. You can get a subscription on our website, marxist.ca. It'll be linked again in the chat. So make sure you get that subscription. It's a big deal. It's an excellent publication. So yeah. So moving into the breakout rooms. Actually, one last thing. Sorry, I forgot. On September 30th, we will be having a rally. The Canadian Federation of Students is holding it. On that day, we'll be going out there as the Fight Back contingent, the Marxist contingent of the movement. So if you're in Toronto or around Toronto or will be in Toronto in that day, we have a Facebook event outlining the details. Come and join us. right, come with us into our contingent, and we'll all go down to the rally together. And that way we can kind of represent the socialist forces of the student movement and the workers movement at this rally. So it's quite important. So come out, you know, it's important to not just have discussions about these things, but like Alex said, actually organize for a socialist future. So with that, we will now break into the breakout rooms. Let's get going. Let's separate.